Hi, my name's John Whitlam, and I teach Língua Inglesa aplicada à Tradução on the courses of English translation and English teaching. For these lessons, normally the students are together in the same class, and because obviously English grammar is the same for everybody. Now, because I'm teaching Língua Inglesa aplicada à Tradução, that means that I teach English grammar in a slightly different way to the way that you're probably used to learning. Most people in Brazil learn English grammar in English courses, and normally you learn English grammar with no reference to Portuguese. Clearly, if you're going to be a translator, you're dealing with two languages, and therefore you have to consider Portuguese as well when studying English grammar. So we look at the equivalences between English and Portuguese at a grammatical level. Not only, obviously, equivalences of vocabulary, but also equivalences of things like verb tenses, etc. Most people who come to do the course have little or no experience of professional translation. Sometimes they have a little bit of experience of translating things for friends, but normally they have no formal training in translation and no experience in translation. So I want to talk about something today which I think exemplifies some of the issues involved in translation, and there are issues which often people who haven't actually sat down to do a translation before have not really stopped to think about. And in order to illustrate this, I thought about talking about the word saudade, because saudade is one of those words that people always say. You always hear people saying saudade is a word that you can't translate. So I think it's an interesting case that we can look at to think about some general issues of translation. If you watched the closing ceremony of the Olympics, there was a moment where the word saudade was projected on the stage, and the commentator on TV said, "Saudade é uma palavra que só existe na língua portuguesa." If you think about this is a very logical sentence, but it's completely self-evident and makes no sense, because it's a bit like saying the word yes is a word that only exists in the English language. Because saudade is a Portuguese word, of course it only exists in the Portuguese language. But a slightly more sophisticated way of saying the same thing, which is something else that you often hear, is saudade não tem tradução em outros idiomas. And how true is this, actually? Well, first of all, you have to know a lot about a lot of other languages in order to be able to make a statement like saudade não tem tradução em outros idiomas. But also, it would be rather unusual if saudade didn't have a translation, because after all, saudade is a feeling that most human beings can feel. So regardless of the language you speak, you might want to express the idea of saudade. So let's look at how we might translate saudade into English in particular. First of all, we need to have a fairly clear idea what we mean by saudade. What does saudade mean? So if we look in the dictionary, this photograph here, by the way, is an advert for Google Translator, which is rather clever. which is a visual way of saying that apparently saudade has no translation in other languages. If we look in the dictionary, this is from the dictionary Mini-Weiss, defines saudade as sentimento nostálgico ligado à memória de alguém ou algo ausente. I'm sure most people can relate to that. If we look at a definition from another dictionary, this is a slightly more detailed definition. Sentimento melancólico resultante da ausência de alguém querido, de algo que se gostaria de ter de volta, do afastamento de algum lugar ou de situação já vivida e que se gostaria de viver de novo. This shows us that, as you know, you can feel saudade about a variety of different things. You can feel saudade for a person, you can feel saudade for things, you can feel saudade for time past, for example. And the important thing here is that in both these definitions, in the first one we had sentimento nostálgico, this one we have sentimento melancólico. So it's a slightly sad feeling. It doesn't actually go as far as sadness. Some dictionaries say sentimento nostálgico mais suave. Saudade is a kind of sentimento suave. It's not a feeling of desperation. Looking at these definitions, we can kind of summarize these definitions in English by saying saudade is the feeling of missing someone or something. The problem in English is that we don't have a single word, we don't have one word in English which means exactly that, the feeling of missing someone or something. It would be nice if we could use if we could use the word missing as a noun. I'm feeling missing, but that doesn't work. So we can paraphrase the meaning of saudade using the verb miss, but we don't have a single word which corresponds exactly to saudade. However, I should say here that for historical reasons, it's clear that saudade plays a very important part in Portuguese and particularly Brazilian culture. It's very common in the poetry of all languages to express a feeling of missing a loved one, a time past, your childhood, a place you loved. These are very common themes in the poetry of all languages because they're very common human emotions. But saudade undoubtedly has a particular significance for Brazilians because originally when the Portuguese came to Brazil, it was mostly young men, some of them married, some of them not, who left their families, their wives, their families behind in Portugal and came to Brazil and then felt saudade, saudade for their country, saudade for their loved ones, etc. So for historical and geographical reasons, obviously Brazil is quite a long way from Portugal, and in those days it took a long time and it wasn't necessarily a straightforward journey. Saudade has become this very important concept in Brazilian culture. It's not such a major concept in the culture of the English-speaking world, but it's nevertheless an emotion that everybody feels from time to time. If we look at how the word saudade is used in Portuguese, then we can see that by far the most common usage is probably in the expression estar com saudade de alguém ou algo, ficar com saudade de alguém algo, or sentir saudade de alguém algo, which means more or less the same thing. These expressions mean more or less the same thing. Once you have the word saudade within this linguistic context, within this expression, it's then very easy to translate because in English we can use the verb to miss someone or something. Often in Portuguese you can use saudade without necessarily having the verb estar com, ficar com, sentir, but it's kind of an abbreviated form. So, for example, you might say, saudades daquela época, when you really mean estou com saudades daquela época. So in English you could say, I miss that time. Similarly, at the end of an email or a letter, you can put saudades. And obviously that actually means estou com saudades de você, normally. The equivalent of that in English is putting at the end of your email, missing you. So saudade is actually quite easy to translate in this particular phrase and abbreviations of this phrase. If we look at some other phrases with where saudade is commonly used, for example, está morrendo de saudade de alguém, está morrendo de saudade de algo. Again, we can use the verb to miss in English, and the common expression in English is to say to miss someone terribly, miss something terribly. We use the adverb terribly, is the most common collocation. But also in more informal language, you can say to miss someone like crazy, to miss something like crazy. So this is also quite easy to translate, this expression. In Portuguese, you can also say que saudade de você, que saudade da minha casa, que saudade do meu país. And again, in this case, we can use the English verb miss, slightly formal sounding translation. How I miss my mother, how I miss my country. Slightly more informal way of saying it would be, I miss my mother so much, I miss my country so much. So again, this is fairly easy to translate using the verb miss. Another common expression with saudade is matar saudade de alguém. Normally, the way that we translate this, the way we express this in English, is to say to catch up with somebody, if you mean spending time with somebody after you haven't seen them for a long time. In English, we used the phrasal verb to catch up. So, faz tempo que eu não te vejo, a gente precisa matar saudades. We need to catch up, is what we would say in English. So that's also fairly straightforward to translate. Matar saudades de algo is slightly more complicated. But a translation which will work is to get a dose of something. So, eu preciso matar saudades do meu país. I need to get a dose of my country, you could say in English. Another expression that's often used is deixar saudades. Uma pessoa que morre deixa saudades. In English here, in this case, we use the passive of the verb to miss, so to be missed. Ele vai deixar muitas saudades, he'll be much missed, or he'll be sorely missed, is what we say. So again, we have the verb to miss here, translating saudade. As we've seen from these examples, and this is a general principle about translation, You're always, with translation, you're always translating words within their context, and you're not translating the words in isolation. So you don't simply translate one word at a time. You look at the whole sentence, and often what is one word in one language will be 3 words in another language, or what is 3 words in one language will be 1 word in another language. If we look at the most common expression with saudade, we saw that the linguistic context is estar com, saudade de. So we can identify estar com de as the linguistic context. These are the words that co-occur with saudade. But we also have, apart from the linguistic context, we also have the semantic context. So, for example, if I say, quando você volta, estou com saudades, it's pretty clear that I mean, estou com saudades de você. The context tells me that because I said, quando você volta. And so the translation in English would be, I miss you, because the verb miss in English has to have an object complement. So we have to include an object of some kind. Similarly, if the semantic context is foram bons tempos, estou com saudades, clearly here we mean estou com saudades dos bons tempos. So the translation in English would be I miss them. So in the process of translation, we're looking at these 2 types of context. We're looking at the linguistic context, the words that are used together with the main word, and we're also looking at the semantic context, the kind of wider context of what we're saying. And using those 2 things, we can produce a perfectly good translation, a perfectly idiomatic translation in English. I should mention here that in English we have a special word if you're talking about saudade de casa or saudade de seu país, because in English we have the word homesickness, which describes a feeling of saudade de casa. And we can also use the adjective homesick. So, estou com saudade de casa, you can translate as I'm homesick, or estou com saudade do meu país could also be I'm homesick. You can also specify the country. So, if you're Brazilian and you want to say estou com saudade do Brasil, you can say in English I'm homesick for Brazil. So by looking at the linguistic context, by looking at the expressions in which we find the word saudade, by translating the combination of words, and not just translating the word saudade on its own, we can find perfectly good and perfectly idiomatic translations in English. There are, of course, cases where that's not so easy because we come across the word outside those particular linguistic contexts. And then we have to be a little bit more creative. So here are 2 fairly famous quotations where we have the word saudade used not in one of those expressions that we looked at before. So we have to find a different translation in this case. The first one, a saudade é o amor que fica, is a very common phrase that you come across quite often. And the second example, o tempo não para, só a saudade é que faz as coisas pararem no tempo. If we look first of all at the first sentence, in this case, we can translate saudade as fond memories. Memories obviously means lembranças, but the important word here is fond, because fond in English suggests not only pleasant memories, but it also suggests memories of something or somebody that you loved And that obviously ties in with the idea of o amor que fica. And I was a little bit inventive with the translation of o amor que fica, because it sounds nicer, neater in English to say fond memories are what love leaves behind. In the other example, I chose to use the word wistful. Wistful is not an extremely common word in English, but it is a word which means exactly, it exactly corresponds to the meaning of saudoso. We do actually have a word wistfulness in English, which means a qualidade de saudoso, but I could have used it in this translation, but it sounds neater rather than to say wistfulness, to say wistful memory, or you could possibly say wistful longing. So my translation of this sentence would be, time doesn't stand still, it's only wistful memory that makes things stand still in time. So what about the song by Tom Jobim and Vinícius de Moraes, Chega de Saudade? Now, if we look at the context, if we look at the semantic context of this song, we can see that it's talking about ela. So we're obviously talking about saudade dela, and my translation of this would be, I'm done missing her, or done missing her, which is exactly the sort of thing that you hear in song lyrics. I'm done doing something in English means I've had enough of doing it. I'm not going to do it anymore. If you look in Google, you'll find that there are lots of song lyrics where they talk about done missing you, I'm done missing you, I'm done missing her. So this would be my translation within the song. Again, we have the verb to miss. So by looking at these examples with saudade, which is this word that often people say there is no translation of, it can tell us some important principles about translation in general, not just about the translation of the word saudade. So the first thing it tells us is that there's not always a single word-for-word equivalent from one language to another. That translation would be so easy if there was a single word-for-word equivalent for every single word in the language, but of course there's not. An extension of that is the fact that an idea that might be expressed with a noun, a substantivo, in one language, like saudade, may be more commonly expressed with a verb in another language. For example, the verb to miss in English. This switching from one part of speech, classe gramatical, to another is something that happens a lot. So, for example, in Portuguese, when you want to talk about being hungry, you use a noun, estou com fome. In English, we use an adjective, I'm hungry. So switching from one classe gramatical to another is not really a big deal. That happens a lot. We've also seen that words have to be translated as part of their linguistic and semantic context and not in isolation. So you're often translating a group of words rather than translating a single word. And often by translating a group of words, it's possible to arrive at a much more idiomatic translation than by translating words in isolation. We've seen from the variety of translations that I used in the examples with saudade that often in one language, there's a whole range of different words that are used to express a particular idea, depending on the linguistic and the semantic context. While in another language, it's possible to do it with a single word, which is the case with Saudade. And finally, we've seen that Saudade is obviously an important concept in Brazilian culture, more so than in the English-speaking world. But clearly, it's an emotion that we can all feel and express, regardless of our culture or language. So that means logically there has to be a way to express it in English and in other languages. So that's all. I hope that you found it interesting and it gives you something to think about. And please come to the class and hear more interesting questions about translation. Thank you very much.